Hello and welcome to Health Innovators. I'm your host, Jonah Comstock, Editor-in-Chief of Pharma Forum. My guests today are Shoval and Shahar Shelly, CEO and CMO, respectively, of Remepy. Remepy is a new kind of digital therapeutics company using digital interventions to increase the efficacy of drugs, not indirectly by improving adherence, but directly. It leverages ideas about the brain-body connection that are long known but little understood. But I'll let my guests get into that. Guys, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having us, Jonah.
Thanks, Jonah. Great to be here.
So, did I get it right in that intro? Tell me a little bit about the high level of kind of what you guys do and how you do it.
Yeah. So first of all, you got it right. And essentially, what Remepy is about is about enabling pharmaceutical companies to launch what we call software drug combinations. So from our perspective, many drugs in the future would be brought to market and used with a tailored software application. We see the effectiveness of digital therapeutics in the market, but there hasn't been a product yet that has really cracked down the business model within the digital therapeutic world. And what we believe that the digital abilities are here for is to improve drugs, because drugs are wonderful and drugs are here to stay. And what we're trying to do is harness the digital abilities to change our physiology in order to improve the effectiveness of drugs.
And maybe, or you could go into a little bit of how that works or why it works, that the science that it's built on.
Yeah, so essentially, what we're doing is we're looking at different mechanisms of actions of drugs. And we're trying to identify what do we need to do in order to improve their effectiveness. And, you know, when we're talking about effectiveness of drugs, it varies in different ways. Some drugs need to be more efficacious. Others are effective enough or enough, their efficacy is enough, but they have tremendous side effects or they're very addictive. Others are effective. They don't have so many side effects, but they're not effective at enough people, or they're effective for just a small period of time. So we're trying to identify, and we have a very strong medical and scientific and psychological team in Remepy. We're trying to identify what do we need to do that could be achieved by a digital interaction that would improve each and every drug. And Shachar, maybe I'll pass it to you and you could explain this from your perspective.
Absolutely. I think it's fascinating, the concept that our brain can actually change the way drug works in our body. The concept that the brain can modulate the immune system is not new. It's actually pretty old, and the understanding that our emotional state or our physiology actually change the way our, even in the cellular level or even at a genetic level, how do we respond to different drugs or disease? Let's think about a disease as a biological challenge. And we have to withstand this challenge when we're facing a disease, especially if it's a disease that can get us dead or kill us. As a response to this biological challenge, a normal person's brain would usually respond in a chronic stress response. This chronic stress response would actually mitigate and would weaken the body's defense mechanism against that specific disease that wants to destroy us. And we as a company, using digital elements, are harnessing specific brain networks that are responsible for controlling the stress-related reactions. And in that way, we could activate certain pathways to help drugs fight the same diseases, especially, as I mentioned, diseases that are dangerous and can actually destroy us, such as cancer or degenerative diseases such as Alzheimer, or there is additional concept of acute fear. There are certain medical procedures that requires, for example, let's say eye injections that are, let's call them ultra stressogenic. And patients just refuse to undergo or undertake these procedures just because of this element. So that's another way that we could, by activating certain brain areas, we change the functional and activate specific changes in the immune system to help fight those specific diseases or the stress response, as I mentioned in the example of the intraocular injections. And I think I see this as a window to the future, Jonah, and I really enjoy reading your publications because the digital universe is becoming one with our personal universe. Essentially, it's becoming another dimension of our lives, and I don't think it's far-fetched to understand that we're going to need to harness this extra dimension to let it propagate and diffuse into the medical universe, but as a full-blown capacity. Excuse me, not as a standalone, but as a must-have in any procedure or medical treatment. That's what I see. That's what we see as a company as the future.
The piece that was hard for me to get my head around is sort of the nature of the software itself, because so many digital therapeutics today are either essentially like a monitoring or adherence play, or they're concerned specifically with psychological or neurological conditions, so for insomnia or depression, et cetera, et cetera. But your app doesn't really fit into either of those categories. I say app, the various kind of softwares you're developing. It's a much more kind of well, talk to me about what the patient experience of the software is, and how that's different from what's out there right now.
Yeah. So that's a great question. Essentially, I could say that we have two main groups of interventions that we're using. We have psychological interventions that are addressing and trying to modulate the immune system. And we have cognitive interventions that are focusing on brain plasticity and synaptic connectivity. And we're using, different techniques for different disease and different drugs as needed for each and every one of them. What we have identified that many other digital therapeutic companies have done is that they have been able to change the quality of life of patients. They have been able to change the psychological or biological factors of patients. But in order to really work with a drug, you have to take a rigid approach and actually show that you're impacting in an objective manner. Because the amount of pain that you or I feel, or the amount of psychological stress, is something very subjective. And if you really want to increase the effectiveness of drugs or work with them really synergistically, you have to actually be able to measure your effect in an objective manner. And so because of that, the clinical trials that we're doing and conducting these deals, there are, we have a software application, but we're testing it in the same approach that pharma companies are doing while they're developing drugs. So in essence, you could say that we're creating this digital molecule and pharma are creating, traditional molecules. And we're trying to integrate these two type of molecules. That first one is produced in pharma plant, but the other one is produced by our brain. And these two different molecules work together. So essentially, that's the two groups, and this is how they're working together.
Maybe I would add, because Jonah wanted to have some sort of patient's experience concept or understanding. So there are many types of exercises, Jonah. That's why it's hard to. But I would give you one example in attention training in cancer patients. Um, there is a notion or a scientific system in our brain that is responsible for synchronizing the right and left lobes, or hemispheres, more to say. And for example, when one individual can hear a sound in one hemisphere and then hear the continuation of that sound to the other hemisphere. For example, if you take a simple known tune, such as, I don't know, maybe okay? Then when you synchronize between the two hemispheres, you activate a certain super network. This network would work on attention and would, for a few seconds, would cause chemicals called dopamine secreting neurons to be activated in certain brain areas. This would downstream would activate other chemicals that the downstream element would be anti-cancer eventually, or would push the patient away if it's a pendulum from pro-inflammatory to anti-inflammatory. This is just one example. There are, for example, there is one more exercise of guided imagery. Guided imagery is another good example of activating systems that are anti-cancer mechanisms. Those networks that can work and help us harness what we call the brain power to fight the disease. Okay, how would the patient will actually experience that? You would have a person on the screen explaining the exercise and explaining why is it so meaningful. The patient would have to participate in a so-called or activated game or some sort of an interface. So these are two examples. There are many more. Tell me if you feel like you
No,
can
that's very helpful
comprehend.
and
Yes.
super interesting. Maybe though it would be good to hear a little bit about kind of what in particular you guys are working on. I know that you're sort of early stage in some ways, but you're standing on a pretty sizable amount of evidence and research, right?
Yes. So, Shahar, do you want to talk about the research? Should I begin? What do you prefer?
I think I would maybe give a short intro, and then you could talk about the clinical trials. So we are essentially integrating or interfacing two super systems, if you like to call it. Imagine those two super systems to be the brain and the immune system. And we are standing on the shoulders of giants in a way that our lab or our CSO have been studying these issues and brought, he had his postdoc at Harvard, and he brought a lot of interesting data and concepts about how the brain actually works. And the notion that the brain is divided, the previous notion that the brain is divided into different real estates, that one part of the brain control one function, was essentially not so accurate. And today we know it's more of a network-like structure. And also, if one part of the brain degenerates, another part can take the damaged part's function. So that's Professor Ahmedi's research, together with a lot of other researchers throughout the world, that showed us the fountainhead of how the brain controls those types of networks and how they connect to the immune system. This is the basis of how we actually investigate and invent our interactions in different diseases. And so maybe all can give some examples of it. This is super interesting, by the way. I think 50-hour seminar won't be enough to talk about this enough. But just in a nutshell.
So, or tell me a little bit about what kind of your early targets are, and what's in trials. What do you expect to sort of get out there first if all goes well?
Yeah. So we have done a lot of internal internal trials and internal checks, both in terms of the user experience and the user journey and everything. And now we are conducting 2 trials. So our 2 main focuses or primary focuses are neurology and oncology, which Shahar actually touched upon. And we're also looking with different pharma companies on other areas, also in ophthalmology and in other unique areas, which all are actually based on the connection between the brain and the immune system, this neuroimmune axis. So these are our first target, and we're also obviously looking at different autoimmune diseases as they're very much connected to this world.
Great. We're coming towards the end of our time. We have a little time left. But I'd love to hear kind of taking a step back from your work more broadly. When we first talked about this, or you sort of talked about the next generation of digital therapeutics, how do you see this kind of being incorporated into some existing care paradigms, and how do you see it sort of changing those as hopefully you guys succeed in your work and other folks start to take up this kind of intervention too?
Yeah. So, I think that digital therapeutics is a new wave that have emerged in the past 6 or 7 years. It began, and now it's a new wave. It's a new wave. I think most of the companies, amazing companies, have done, great achievements, but none of these companies have actually cracked down the business model. And from our perspective, we think that pharma companies are going to control and are still kind of controlling what type of medication patients are receiving. They have the strongest market education channels, and this is how this market is working. So from our perspective, the great change is going to happen through pharma companies, and this is the reason that we're working with them, with big pharma companies, and also with relatively small and mid-sized drug development companies who sometimes are more capable or are more willing to innovative transformations. So essentially, I think that we all understand that the digital, there's this part which is a new extension of our body. It's called our smartphones. We're not leaving our house. We're not going to anywhere without our smartphones. And we're using it for everything in our lives. We're using it to order food. We're using it to see a movie, to see what's the weather tomorrow. And it's kind of weird that we're not using it, or people who are taking medications are not, day by day, chronically, are not using the app in a really integrated way. So I think this is a transformation that would happen, and it's just trying to figure out what's the best way to make it happen.
Anything to add, Shahar?
I would actually want to ask you a question, Jonah.
Go ahead.
I would like to ask you, from everything you read and from your knowledge this far, where do you think the digital world, how far would it diffuse into the medical universe? What's your opinion? Where do you see us in 10 years from now?
It's so hard to say, because I've honestly been sort of covering digital health for about 10 years now. And even though it always seems like adoption is slow and regulation is slow, if you look back then and you look now, we really have come a long way in a lot of different areas in terms of leveraging the power of digital, leveraging data, leveraging AI. So I think, in many ways, in 10 years, this landscape is going to be unrecognizable. I think I don't know, digital therapeutics have been getting off the ground for a long time. and there are a lot of hurdles, but at the end of the day, things that show efficacy, things that work, things that improve, patient experience, things that save money, all those things are going to sort of proliferate and grow, because the market incentive is there for them to do it. And the things that don't, the things that people have tried that are maybe not working as well as they should, that don't have the upside, or they don't fit into the system that we live in and the way that it pays for things, are going to be casualties along the way. But I think the overall arc is towards progress and change. I do think, obviously, not the first person to say this about digital therapeutics, reimbursement is kind of the last biggest wall to scale for figuring out how to pay for these things the way that we pay for drugs, or in a different, better way, is going to make it a lot easier to make this an attractive space to be in.
Of course. Yeah.
Was that a good answer? What do you think?
I have to say, yes, I completely agree with you, and I would add something from my neurological universe, that the more time passes that we as a civilization are together with, living with and next to a digital companion, if you like to call the smartphone that way, or a personal assistant, whatever, the neurological bonds that connect between us and those instruments are getting stronger, essentially. It's not the first time, I can tell you, that there are already people who can actually get depressed if something happened to their smartphone, or they have low battery. It's actually changing their physiological state. I think it's definitely becoming an integral part of us. Real, who are we actually? Part of us is the phone. It has memories. It has everything we think. It has our creativity and the music we hear and the people we talk with.
And it extends our abilities. We can now take a picture. We can accurately know what time it is. All these things that are, might as well be innate until we run out of battery, of course.
Right.
And if you're talking about healthcare, one of the major challenges is actually personalizing each and every treatment. And it's very hard to personalize a drug, right? It passes an FDA. It might have 2 or 3 different doses, but then how could you actually really personalize it to each and every one of us? Because we're all different. And the phone actually knows us, some say better than we do. So with AI tools, with machine learning tools, and different abilities that, LLMs, that we're actually using in our applications, so you are able to create actually something new, something better.
Awesome. Well, that seems like a great note to end on. Thank you so much, guys, for joining me, and look forward to seeing more and hearing more as you move forward with the work you're doing.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.